Firstly, I just want to welcome you to the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning in our temporary home. We are currently in a decant space for the next year and a half and currently on site with a new facility on the campus. My name's Alan Peart. I'm the Director of the Melbourne School of Design. Recently joined, as you can probably tell. I've been here, I think, 9 months in total. I'd like to begin tonight's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders, families, both past and present. Easy for a Glaswegian to say. Now, this is really quite a fantastic opportunity for me personally to welcome Angus Farquhar to the faculty. Angus and I have developed quite a big friendship over the years, but also through a working relationship when I joined the board of NVA back in, I think it was the tail end of 2006. So I was someone who was very much a spectator of NVA's incredible shows and performances over a number of years, and then joined the board and got an insight into some of the ways that NVA work. And I think there's a big correlation with my interest in coming to Melbourne. One of the things that attracted me to the faculty here was its diversity of subject. It wasn't just an school of architecture. It was a faculty that had architecture, landscape at the core of it, and that's something I think has got a massive opportunity in the future for us. Also, in terms of its wider relationship to other disciplines across the university, and it's something that NVA seems to do naturally. We talk a lot within academia about research partnerships. And we try very hard to pull these off. We talk about relationships with industry and with communities. And it's something that NVA over the years have managed to do without really thinking too hard about it, or the perception on the outside as they do this. And it's something that's very hard to pin down, I think. And I've tried over the years to describe who NVA are as a board member. And if you read through, if you just do a quick Google search, which I did back in 2008, I think we were given the job as a board to try and define who NVA were. And it's a very difficult thing to do. They cross over all sorts of weird and wonderful disciplines. If you look at, as I say, if you do a Google search, they're described as artists, environmental landscape artists, performers, producers. There are a whole myriad of things. And I think you'll see that tonight through the projects that they present, that they manage to traverse a number of disciplines. And I think the key thread through all of it is this notion of place and people. It's one thing that really comes out loud and clear in all of the work. They uncover histories of sites, hidden narratives. I think I read somewhere about this idea of a kind of animated archaeology, which I think becomes really apparent in a lot of the work. Now, there's also a really interesting thing. About a year ago, in the Invisible College project, which Angus touched on earlier today, and we'll talk a bit about tonight. The Invisible College deals with a site, a contested landscape, as Angus describes it, which involves a Catholic seminary building in the outskirts of Glasgow. And it's within a very interesting, mature, and what used to be a managed estate. Now, the Invisible College is a Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project that brings together the disciplines of geography, architecture, interior design. It pulls together the streams of heritage and conservation. And importantly, landscape plays a massive part in it. Now, for 20 years, growing up as an architecture student, not that I was an architecture student for 20 years, but growing up for 20 years around the profession, the fascinating thing about that building is that it was all about this modernist ruin. I visited it first in 1989, and every year as a student, I went back to the site to look at this building and fought my way through a landscape and never really paid any attention to the landscape, just wanted to get to this building. And I think one of the incredible things that NV have done, or Angus has done over the years, the last few years, is take this emphasis away from a building and start to get you to think about the landscape surrounding that building and the journey to the building. And that simple thing has completely changed the way people are looking at this building and the way they're looking at this site. So it's been a building that architects have tried for many a year to find a use for. Developers have come in to look at the land, and it's taken an arts organisation and a bit of radical thinking to take that project forward. And we're really at the cusp of something quite amazing with that as a building. We get taken to the Venice Biennale in 2010 to present it, and there was a group of about 30 people that attended that event. And it was a pivotal moment, I think, in getting Historic Scotland and some key political players round a table to talk about the future of a building. So that project for me, which I was one of the partners in terms of the funding, and I'm really hopeful that we can bring this to Melbourne in some shape or form. And exactly a year ago, Ginny and I walked to site. Ginny came over before I knew Ginny and took part in one of the workshops. There was about 50 of us walked to site for a day, and a very unique day because it was sunny in Scotland. And we walked to site, 50 people from all walks of life, from a myriad of disciplines. And it was a very special day for me because it was the day I decided to come to Melbourne. So quite an important thread. So anyway, without further ado, I welcome Angus Farquhar.
I'm just going to dim it. I'm going to dim it a bit and make this a little bit more theatrical. A little bit more. How many of you weren't here this afternoon? Okay, so it's about half-half. So for those who were here this afternoon, I apologise if I go over any well-trodden ground that you'll remember from 2 or 3 hours ago. We had an interesting session this afternoon around reuse of industrial buildings. What I'm going to take you through is NVA is a really unusual beast because it works collectively, and by working collectively, I mean I'll work with anything from up to 20, 30, 40, 60, last year 120 people, often to make a piece of work that's durational for a number of weeks in a chosen landscape. And that 120 people might consist of people from 10 or 20 different disciplines, all of whom are bringing their special discipline, bringing their knowledge to bear to make a piece of work. It'll often involve local people, and it'll value the knowledge of local people, basically because they've often got a very interesting view on the place that you've chosen to make the work. So the idea of working in a place without working with local people is really a non sequitur. There's a lot of work talked about community and about, it's a sort of language, a kind of funding-led language. There is an output to work with community. It's very important, and everybody should work with community. That's very good. But of course, the truth is, why do you do it? You don't do it for the sake of it. You do it because there are many, many knowledges that come together to privilege an understanding of a place. There isn't one. My idea of what I want to do somewhere is only as relevant as its relevance to the other people I bring in and their perspectives on a place and how you begin to evolve a work, if the work's going to have any depth. We used to call it parachute art, where you go in and you sort of drop a show into a place. And if it's going to be a real relationship, then it has to be something that evolves over time in a generous spirit. And generosity doesn't mean non-authorship. A work always has to start from a strong idea, or start from a strong place, or a clear vision, or a clear idea why you want to go there. But you really know that in knocking that work together, the shape of it will come from all of those people who participate in making that piece of work. So you both have a geographical community, and you have the community who make the work, and then you have community of interest of those who come to see it. So you have all of these different notions of people and how they interact. And but when I talk now, the privilege of standing here in front of you, I talk as me, and often with me it's a sort of philosophical or a political or a spiritual dimension that's driving me to make the work. So I'll kind of fairly shamelessly talk I and we throughout the night, because I can't help it but be that way. But the act of the bottle is speaking to me. The act of making the work is often driven from a first idea, and then this way of working communally, which I think, to be honest, is I think you have to work to your limitations. Each of us work to our limitations of knowing what we're good at, and then being humble enough to realize that there's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than you, and then being cunning enough to draw them into your web, and then to work together so that you end up building these incredible ways where the specificity of knowledge becomes part of a sort of total web of knowledge, which is kind of, I suspect, by most of you even being here, is in some way what you're interested in doing with your lives. It's this amazing human capacity, what it is to be human, to have this chance to evolve this strange thing we have in our heads, and to evolve our understanding on the, whatever, 70 to 90 years that we might be privileged to be on Earth, and to take it as far as we can go. And that's really what I'm doing, is just trying to make the most of the limited capacity I have, and to share that with enough people to make these meaningful moments where you understand the process of being alive better, and the process of the land you stand on, and what it means to you. And I suppose in many ways it often comes basically to the act of observing what is in front of you. Whether it's in an urban landscape, some of the work I'll show you tonight will be very urban, or in a very, very rural landscape. And obviously the rural landscape in Scotland, where I specifically have chosen to make my work for the last 15 years, is very different to an Australian rural landscape. Whether there are any parallels or not, I don't know. I can't really speak for that. It's very, very different mythologies at play. But there are some comparators that might be interesting. But it's the act of observing that I think is the key. And sometimes the act of observing, we talk a lot, and I hear in academia, often you talk a lot about the process of it being complex, and it's often about reading all the layers and trying to knit together complex versions of reality. And then sometimes it's the absolute reverse. It's stripping back everything until you get to the very simple way of seeing, where the things that cloud your vision are left, and you get a chance to have a very direct relationship to the phenomena that surround you, and your experience, and how you experience the actual physical space around you. And what I do, I suppose, is manipulate that space. A lot of the work you'll see here takes place at night, and it uses lighting as a medium. I also use sound, and I use architecture and design and conversation and movement. And movement's probably the key one, is how we move through the world, and the different speeds that we move through the world at. And as you move through the world at different speeds, how that enables you to see and react to what's around you. And different speeds allow different reactions. You won't see the car privileged, you won't see the train, you won't see the plane. I think they're degraded forms of travel. They're there for speed. They're there for expediency. They're there for practical progress. But the real movement is on foot, in the act of walking, running, climbing, biking. That's the speed to see the world. That's where the world becomes alive. Really alive in your relationship to everything else is just a fucking blur. And we all do it. I mean, I'm not going to proselytize. I mean, I'm as guilty. I'm not going to come here as a green proselytizer, because I'm not. I use it, but I really love work that just allows us to slow down enough to take in the world and its richness. That's my preamble. As you can tell, I'm not short of a word or two, so I will, but I'm definitely going to try and do this in a way that leaves time for questions. I love talking about my work. As I said, it's a privilege to come and share your life with a group of new people, but unless you walk out of here having got something out of it for yourselves, and as part of your developmental journey, it's a sort of waste of time, really. So please, if you have questions, we leave a decent block of time to make this two-way rather than this, one voice to a lot of people watching. So I'm going to take you through about 10 years worth of work, and I'll try not to get too bogged down. Each piece of work could have taken 1, 2, 3 years to make, so I'm going to shamelessly telescope these works down. But I've decided to give quite a big range of pieces, just to give you insight into the way one particular person has chosen, what I've chosen to do with my life over the last 15 years. And hopefully it'll resonate with some things for you. So I'm going to start 13 years ago. And This is in the Scottish Highlands, which is, in Australian terms, a very small range of hills, but in Scottish terms, a very big set of mountains. So we have to understand scale in an interesting way. You know, they're accessible fairly quickly. You can get through a series of roads to get to these hills. By big, I say 3,000 feet. That constitutes a Munro in Scotland, and there's a fine set of Munros. And this is a glen or a valley. And I spent 2 years searching for a natural landscape in Scotland where the authorities would let me in. So this is the first interesting question, is one of ownership and access. Who owns the land? Who gives you the right to do something transgressive with a landscape? By transgressive, I mean the massive technical intrusion into this landscape at night. And here's the first paradox of the work at this time, is that we were using available technologies in this period, which was oil-fired generators, 42 kilometers of cable, 14,000 light bulbs, and we used enough energy to light up a small village and go into a natural landscape to give a primarily urban audience a chance to walk into that landscape at night. And we were really proud of it. We were proud of the technical achievement. But in reality, this is a completely transgressive piece of work. And it gets even more ironic because we were espousing spiritual values and trying to look at a really, really deep understanding of landscape. But be unashamed about using the technology of our time. And this was the technology of our time, and we were pushing what that technology was capable of doing. So we created this 6-kilometer route that went up to about 1,400 feet. I don't know if, do you do feet here? Or you meters? 400 or 500 meters. It was a walk that took about 2.5 hours. And the route was split. It's an old drove road, so it's where they used to drive cattle. If you imagine it was sheep or cattle, drive up to the highlands in the summer, better grass, feed the cattle, and then take them back down in the winter. So you went up a western drove road, and then you came down an eastern drove road. And what we decided to do with this work was to make an analysis of Highland landscape traditions. And I thought, where are the really, really great Highland landscape traditions? And I began to obsessively read mountaineering literature. And particularly the mountaineers who are also cultural climbers as well as hard technical climbers. And you get drawn to South America, but ultimately you always get drawn back to the Himalayas. The Himalayas are really the great climbing ranges of the world. And of course, primarily, if you go into North India, if you go into Nepal, you go into Tibet, you're entering Himalayan Buddhist territory, or the earlier religions of Bonpo. And you get very, very particular readings of landscape, which are still survive because these are pre-industrial cultures. There hasn't been that sort of massive dislocation of people from very, very, very rural settings. A lot of those traditions that have maybe been in existence for 4,000 or 5,000 years are still actually felt and still used by people there. And I decided to make a comparison with the landscape traditions of Gaelic Highland culture. And Gaelic Highland culture being that pre-Christian reading of landscape that would give particular significance or characteristic to particular places within a landscape. Tree, waterfall, top of a mountain, the pass between two mountains. These places, until you begin to read the topography, not as a physical landscape, but to read the topography as a symbolic landscape. And it's only buried 200, 300, 400 years back in Scottish history, Irish history, Welsh history. So it was a chance to Also, in a sense, not pay homage, because all of the original people who lived in this glen were forced out. Originally, it was 18 separate villages, and now it's 70 holidaymakers, and it's owned by the rich for hunting and shooting and fishing. So it's a classic transition towards private land use. But to open up for a very urban audience the possibility to remake a link with those traditions on their own terms. So this was what we attempted to do in this strange process. And you can see there the ring of pink light is around a particular rock, which was about 4 meters high, called the Praying Hands of Mary. It was a rock cleft like this. And this gives you a feel for the work. So we started in the west with this journey through Gaelic Highland landscape, and then you crossed a bridge, and as you crossed the bridge, we transited into a Himalayan Buddhist reading of landscape. And I worked with a lot of Sherpas who I'd met climbing in Nepal, and Tibetan musicians, and I brought them over, and they built various structures in that landscape from their traditions. And we brought up the Lama from the Tibetan Buddhist monastery in the south of Scotland, who did a full authentic puja and a blessing of the landscape for us. I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. Quite eccentric, but kind of very easy and natural. Why? Because all the Tibetans and Nepalese said, this landscape's just like the Khumbu Icefall. It feels like we feel at home. So how transitions can slot in from different parts of the world, and it's just about how you read and how you feel and how you sit in a landscape. So it didn't feel pretentious, even if it sounds a bit far-fetched sometimes. Well, why would you put these ideas together? It actually is about finding the source, but not doing it in a kind of faux hippie Mother Earth way, but doing it in quite a kind of transgressive way, because I'm urban, you know. I didn't grow up being a fucking shepherd. So you use your tools. These are your tools, and they're authentic to me. So I brought that into that landscape. But it was a working landscape, and it was a landscape that was used by cows and used by deer and used by sheep. So I wasn't desecrating a kind of pure piece of landscape in any sense. And the process was simply to allow people to walk and to come across things as they went. So the narrative is made through the act of walking. And this is the one commonality that you'll see throughout all this work, is that the work is made by the people who walk the landscape. So the work is only completed by the act of walking. It doesn't exist without that public moving through it and following that path. So it aims to create that different relationship to public and really say that everybody is simply a protagonist in the work. There is no audience. It's there for you. It's just like laying out a present for people. It's there for you to come and to feel what you choose to feel on it. And that's the amazing thing, is that if you have 10,000 people seeing this work, you'll get 10,000 reactions, because each people brings their own history and their own way of seeing. And some of the symbolism is relevant, some of it feels very alien, but they find something within themselves that they can connect to make it part of their story. So this night, and for many, many people, it's the beautiful thing of this work, a kind of invisible authorship, is that I still catch people in conversation talking about this work 13 years later, without knowing that I made it. Oh, I went this walk in the mountains, and I did this, and I saw this, and I felt that. And it's just become part of their narrative. And they remember it. The beauty of doing something different, of being transformative with the landscape, not just taking it as it is that, of course, you create a different set of images, and you allow people to feel different about what they're seeing and what they're feeling. And this bridge, which was built, this was a very practical step, that when we made the transition between East and West, we had a fairly raging torrent coming down. We had to get across. And so the only way to do it was to build a bridge, which we wanted to leave as a permanent legacy, so that in terms of mountain rescue, the Scottish hills, although they're small, are real killers in winter. And the aim was to actually leave a permanent legacy in the landscape, so that in winter, people coming down off the hills would be able to get across the spurn and get down the roads and get out, and mountain rescue could get up and down. And in fact, the man who built this bridge is here tonight, and I'm going to honour him now. This is Ed King. And Ed, who's came to Melbourne how long ago? 8 years ago. So Ed's worked with me over many, many years and has built many of the things that you'll see here were built by Ed. And by chance, Ed has come back and is living in Melbourne with his family, his partner's from here. And so Ed, with a small team, built this bridge, I think, in 3 weeks. About 3 weeks. And to understand the scale of it, those are telegraph poles. And I mean, it's almost an entire story in itself how the bridge was built, but it was a beautiful, absolutely beautiful transition. And to bring a kind of architectural form into that landscape. So rather than doing something prosaic just to get you across, to do something really very, very beautiful with it. And as in the irony of Scottish land ownership, 3 years later, when I went back to look at the site, the landowner, it was a private landowner, had taken the bridge down because they didn't want to encourage the great unwashed to come and access their landscape. So it's one of the ironies of land use in Scotland. I mean, it has changed, and now there are laws where you have a right to roam. You don't currently in England, but you do have a right to roam in Scotland. I'm not sure how the laws on that are here. But this is the problem with private land ownership. You know, you can work very positively with someone to do something with civic values for the public good. But ultimately, if they own the land, it's their right to take it down. Again, one of the ironies of this type of work and its intention. So that was the path in 2000, and from there I'm going to take you straight back into an urban environment with the work that we followed that up with. It was very appropriate to the discussions we had this morning about reuse of industrial space. And this is an area of Glasgow where our company's based. And it was our first permanent project called the Hidden Gardens. And the area is at the back of a tramworks, and you can actually see the tram lines. You can see the original lines which ran northwest down the site. But in the 18th century, it was a nursery. So you also had, in the 18th century, lines of trees being grown on the same southwest lines, running up and down this site. Again, the classic old industrial chimney within it. And I worked with Cities Design Cooperative and a wonderful landscape architect called Rolf Roscher to develop this new oasis in an urban setting. And this is behind quite a famous arts centre called the Tramway. And the Tramway was showing things like Peter Brook's Mahabharata and sort of, you know, the kind of great and good of the contemporary performance world from across the world. But where it actually sat is in an area of South Glasgow which had the largest conglomeration of different nationalities that exist in Scotland. In faith definitions, 18 different Christian sects, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, Jewish, pagan, and then you can go through all the secular differentiations as well, within 10 square miles. It's an amazing melting pot of people. You've got this arts centre within the middle of it, which has absolutely no relationship to the people who live there. You know, they might have well been walking past a void, because no one ever came in. It's a Scottish Asian community, just sort of, it's like a sort of, you know, it's an arts centre for the cognoscenti who are into, you know, Peter Brook and all the rest of it. And I always found that fascinating. It was like a sort of open coffin. There was no atmosphere. There was no, beyond the shows, it was like a sort of dead zone. So the first thing we conceived of to make this work is, how does it sit? How does it sit within this area? What can it be? What can it mean to this area? And the work coincided with the illegal invasion of Iraq by Tony Blair's Labour government at the time, as they hung onto the shirt tails of Donald Rumsfeld and all those joyful hawks in the American government. And it was it was the first moment of true political betrayal for anybody who'd come from a left-wing perspective in Britain. Because when Labour got into power, this was after Thatcher, many of us fought that war in the 80s, and it really was truly a war against Thatcher. It was a straightforward black-white situation. The way that she chose to decimate working class culture. I mean, it wasn't that Murdoch and his new printing presses weren't going to arrive, but it was the way she wanted to rub everybody's face in shit on the way, really wipe them out. And in terms of industrial heritage, all the coal mines, they made sure that all the pit heads were taken down as they made those glorious new empty enterprise zones. I mean, they're wonderful. They're still there, the enterprise zones, and they're still waiting for the enterprise to arrive. Because really it was a political act to decimate that working class culture, because she knew that there was a power within it that was wholly opposed to her version of aggressive capitalism. So we fought that. You see, I'm beginning to digress here. I do apologise. I will not do a tub thumping, and I'm now going to gently take a sip of wine and say to Margaret Thatcher, may she rest in peace. But the thing is that Tony Blair's capitulation and his religiosity and his sense of rightness and his sense of ability, the messianic sense to ignore an entire country, to take the UK into war, and all of the aftermath of that now, where I know there are many places you can't travel to in the world now, because what you represent as a white Brit is understandably a target, because we're just muck, we're filth, we're ideologically impure. He's actually destroyed 2 or 3 generations worth of one worldism. And it felt worse than Thatcher. The Iraq War, the sense of betrayal, it's indescribable. So many of us could never vote Labour again, would never touch them with a barge pole. Because how could people who came from the values that we all grew up with and what we fought for just get into power and reach that moment where they just turn? And so this, in a quiet way, as an artistic reaction, was a reaction against that war, and to give voice, particularly to those communities and those voices who remain invisible within white mainstream culture. So how do you do that? I can blah blah here, and you say, what does it mean? Is this a green space? What's the connection? How did it actually manifest? And so what we did was work over 2 years in a very, very long consultation, probably 300 or 400 face-to-face interviews with people, and about 60 or 70 organisations and all the different religious affiliations. And instead of doing that thing of saying, let's sort of design a fake mogul garden, or let's design a kind of fake monastic garden, we said, let's look at how nature is manifest as an ideal on earth. Because in all spiritual traditions, the garden, the productive garden, manifests itself as heaven on earth. It's absolute commonality of the way nature is used. So it doesn't really matter then whether it's you're dealing with an Orthodox Muslim approach or an Orthodox Hindu approach. You begin to find again those source things that draw people together. So for example, it's the squaring of a garden. If you see that, there's a beautiful Caithness slab that ran in a square, which would be the same slab that would appear in the outring of a Hindu temple, but the same that you would have in the walkway in a monastic. Cloisters. Absolute commonality, allowing you to square the circle. So again, we asked people to engage intellectually and to engage spiritually with the idea of what a garden could be, not to design the fucking thing, because we're designers and we're really, really good at it. And there's often a false narrative around community involvement, which says, well, how would you like to design this place? Which I feel really aggressively against. Because how could someone be a designer who's never designed? It's what people spend 10, 15 years of their life becoming. It's an expertise. But to engage people intellectually in what a garden can be and how it can function for them and how they should feel and how they should use it can allow a different type of ownership. And that's what we kind of fought for. So we really fought off any tendency to create pastiche or to create a pastiche of what a spiritual space should look like, and work more towards how people would intellectually engage with what the garden could be for them. And that kind of worked because they trusted us, because we were honest about it. And the end result was a space that now had its 10th birthday 1 month ago. And it's a very loved space. And a space where many people, this is Eid celebrations for the end of Ramadan with the Muslim community. The most people who'd ever come into the tramway, it was 3,000 people. And I remember standing next to a woman, and she said, you know, I've never felt visible in Scotland before, and I feel visible tonight. And it's that simple thing of honouring difference, honouring otherness, not attempting to get someone to be you or you be them or do it in a fake way, but just honour people's sense of self and give them some space, a beautiful space to be themselves, and to help develop their rituals, again, public rituals, but to do it in a very modern way, and to play with those narratives, ancient narratives, but to do it in a very modern way. And that was it was a good experience, the Eid experience, and a number of these ones. And we did ones for different cultures. So we did Hanukkah with the Jewish community. We did Noel, we did Christian singing at Christmas. And we did Vesak with the Buddhist community. And Diwali with the Hindu community. And very much the first time you do it, you only get the people from those communities. And then gradually, after a bit while, you get a little bit more of people bleeding into each other. It's interested to see what's going on in the other ones. And you get a little bit of crossover. But it kind of wasn't the point. The aim isn't to homogenize, to make a perfect multicultural community, because it just doesn't exist. The aim is to do it in the spirit of mutuality, which is the equality of difference. Just simply to accept difference and let people get on with it. And if they want to come across, they'll come across. If they don't, they don't. So that's the kind of principle with which you explore those notions of identity. And I mean, I have to admit, here as I talk about it, it's all what's coming out of my head, but the reality here is much more fun. It's quite playful and quite simple and visual and sensual. So ultimately, you have to boil down, I think, all of that thinking to things that are really, that people want to come, that they feel unself-conscious doing. It's always the Holy Grail, is to be able to deal with deep content, to deal with spiritual issues, but to do it in a way that doesn't feel self-conscious. I mean, it's interesting in Tibet, for example, there's no word that defines the difference between the spiritual and the daily, the secular and the religious. Whereas we have such clear definitions of you're either God squad or you're a non-believer. Never the twain shall meet. And of course, like most people, you sort of sit somewhere and you have some spiritual values, but they don't quite fit into any tradition. I suspect quite a lot of people in the room would be from that background. And how you have a chance to bring them out and to share them publicly, it's difficult territory. And this is a way, in a sense, that we've kind of explored some of those themes. So from there, I'm going to take on into another, just a reference really to another work that we did that kind of follows in that same tradition. And Yeah, one of the things I really got in Australia is a good relation to food here. I mean, I don't know if it's only, I don't sense that it's a kind of, in Britain, good food's a very middle class thing. You know, it's good food. And, you know, I sense in Australia it's a little bit wider, whereas, you know, poor people, poor areas just eat shit food. And, you know, it's just bad food, bad diet, bad health, horrible vicious cycle. I sense here it's a bit wider because there's such amazing, the migration of food-related stuff going on in Australia is massive, and it's just such an amazing growing landscape. But you've got to bring it into your cities more. I'd be really interested in the narrative about, I'd heard that people have sort of small holdings, or have relatives a bit out of town, and people quite often will have a relationship to good natural food coming in from relatively close. But I don't know how big the allotment movement is here in the urban setting. Because one of the things I would push for in terms of, just as in architecture now, there's absolute heed paid to, you know, the energy use of a building and its energy efficiency. Just in terms of the landscape that surrounds the building, think of it as a productive landscape rather than just fucking grass and trees, and the grass needs water, and that sort of turgid, dull use of urban landscape. Just make it productive. Make every garden a growing space. And my front garden in Scotland is an allotment on road level. No one nicks the food. It's interesting because normally it's only in the back court, but just use every space for growing. And this was this project came about through a 7-year waiting list for allotments in Glasgow. 7 years, you know, to get from here to that door. You know, a little piece of land, and you know, if you want to grow food in Scotland, you know, our growing season is 3 months, if you're lucky, before it starts rotting. I mean, you know, you can have our rain, please. It's brutal. It's brutally short, so you've got to be really clever. And there was a lot of chat this afternoon about what you do with phytotoxically damaged land. You know, what you do working in old industrial locations. And this is a place called the Concrete Garden in Glasgow, in an area called Possil, Rockhill. This is really, really tough territory. It's a hard, poor urban landscape. And this is a brutalised little bit of land behind some advertising hoardings, about as rough as you can get. And you can see the principle here is very simple. This is again done with Rolf Roscher and his new landscape architecture firm, which is now called CRZ, a wonderful designer. This won an Urban Realm Design Award, which was just to build above the ground. Very, very simple principle is just to build just to build above the ground, and to overcome the problems of developers saying, we've got to keep this land because we might be able to open a supermarket in 10 years' time. Sorry, can't use it. And you think, well, fuck, it's just going to sit there, wasted for 10 years. So if you put on these, you can just lift them out. So you can say, okay, we'll do a temporary occupations deal with you. So we'll occupy for 5 years, and then if you find the developer who wants to develop the land, you know they'll never come along, we'll move them off. And again, it overcomes some of those basic problems as to why stalled landscapes occur in urban settings. So again, just to create simple ways to kind of energize bits of landscape. The tatty bags at the top were quite fun. We did this in schools. There was a horror statistic that came out a few years ago in London where a bunch of kids in a primary school were asked, where do chips come from? And 40% of them didn't know they were from potato. It's no joke. It's really no joke. So you think, oh, okay, it's at that level. It's very interesting, isn't it? You know, you in your mind, you think everything's progressing in life, and then you realise in 2013, in, you know, one of the most sophisticated cities in the world, 40% of the kids don't know where a fucking chip comes from. You know, it's really, you have to take time to sort of, it's funny, isn't it? Progress is a funny thing. Sometimes I think we're going to a new dark age. I don't know if we're really progressing. We are medically, but I'm not sure if in societal terms we're really travelling that fast. But what we did then was say, all right, let's just get bags of potato into concrete gardens, double rubble bags. fill them with compost, whack the potatoes in, and the kids can look after them, water them once a week. And then we had the Great Scottish Chip Challenge. And if there's one thing Scots love, it's chips. But I think everyone loves chips. There's something about chips. And it was really funny because the kind of the health gurus were like right on us, like, you can't do this, you can't encourage children to eat chips. I mean, really, we got kind of harassed by people for saying this is unhealthy food. We said it's unhealthy, but at least they know where their unhealthy food came from. And it's a crucial difference, because they're not going to eat a fucking salad. So eat chips, but eat chips from where you've grown them. And it's a first step. But it really worked. It was wonderful. We brought all the dinner ladies down to the Hidden Gardens, and they took all their big fat fryers, and they cooked the best chips. It was fantastic. And all the schools got rosettes. And it was very pure and unhealthy. It was great. Good chips. So again, this scheme, Sow and Grow Everywhere, it was also an attempt. We also worked on, as often with these things, this is the artistic, environmental, community-based front end, but simultaneously we worked on a strategy. And Ertz delivered a strategy to the city around urban farming, which looked at zoning, looked at the way tower blocks, you don't have so many tower blocks here apart from the central business district, but we've got a lot of our housing in the 60s went into tower blocks, with all the problems that you can imagine with that. And they've often got big green deserts around them, unused. Hospitals often have big green deserts around them, just big areas of grassland with no real function apart from to look green, which is fine. It's a good colour. But it's good to sort of think practically, to encourage those who can to just bring productive growing into their landscapes. And so it's important to think strategically and to also try and hook up and work politically at the same time as doing these one-off projects, because otherwise they just become exemplars and they appear in meetings like this with small groups of people, but they don't influence or enter the mainstream. And the truth is that this kind of use of landscape should be mainstreamed within 30 years. There's no point in doing an exemplar unless it's pioneering what should become commonplace. And this, it's such a no-brainer. These should be on every corner. And the people who did it, it's really interesting. If you look internationally, the people who did it was the Cubans. And why did they do it? Because they were starving to death. Because when the blockades happened and they stopped getting some of their food sources, they said, right, okay, well, what are we doing? We've got this fantastic landscape. Let's grow food in every available crack we have. And it's fantastic. And then they had little seed shacks where you could come and, the government would give out seeds. It's kind of communism, the rare occasion where communism actually works. And they turned around, I think in a period of years, they upped the internal production of food by something like 50%. And they literally stopped a generation starving. So it can be really practical. I mean, it always sounds a bit romantic when it comes out of the voice of someone like me as a romantic gesture, but actually it's a really practical gesture, and it should be. And it should be co-opted. It's such an easy thing for governments to work towards. So you would kind of hope that these things, in the end, become truly commonplace and not just, interesting, design interventions. There's our chips. This was great. These were wheatgrass wigs. And they were punk barber, and they sheared the wigs off. And then you got to drink it as a shot afterwards. There were some really frightened kids there. It was great. I'm really all for frightening children. It's great. They need shaken up. That really looks like me when I was 4. It's quite weird. So I'm now going to take you back into natural landscape again. And so you can see the kind of progression on from the path. So you can see you can begin to see a pattern. That's how we chose to work in an urban landscape. But for me, I've still been involved in this long-term attempt to understand what it is I feel. What do I feel about this place I come from? What does it mean to me? What can it mean in a wider sense, and how to share that with a wider public. And so in 2005, we decided to work after an invitation in the northern part of Skye, which is a small island off the west coast of Scotland. A very, very beautiful island. If any of you ever get a chance to travel to the UK, go to the islands. It's a really exceptional experience. It's about as far from London as you can get as an experience. And the landscape was, it was formed, if you imagine that runs down to sea, and then there's maybe about a sort of 3 or 4 kilometre wide sea, and then the mainland of Scotland starts with high mountains there as well. If you go back 17,000 years, it was filled with ice. And that ice ran all the way from here, right the way up to Iceland. It's a complete ice cap. And then as it gradually melted, and then you got the formation with all the rain and erosion of these particular set of cliffs. But the pressure of the ice was so great that the cliffs are still expanding. They're actually still moving back outwards. So we, for example, had a major rockfall 1 year before we did the work. When we were up there doing tests, we had huge rockfalls coming down about 2 minutes from where we just walked. It's an amazing, sentient, living landscape. Quite unusual. And the beautiful thing there is just up in the upper reaches of those cliffs, called the Store Cliffs, this tiny, tiny purslane, and it's from Iceland. And it's seeds that were blown over the ice cap 17,000 years ago, lodged in the Nunatak, the area of the cliff that sits above the ice. Absolutely amazing. So I kind of got into geology. I thought geology is just, really to experience geology close up. So the act of this work was to allow an audience to go from the romance of panorama. And you know how there is a sort of, there's a whole historic painted landscape which works with the panorama. And that form, and that idealized form of the mountain and the big landscape, and it's, we've got Caspar Friedrich, and we've got long traditions of big landscape painting. So this is the absolute polar opposite, is to start with the panorama and then walk closer and closer and closer to the rock until you're at the rock face. And you're into the materiality, you're into the actual physicality of rock, in the same way that a climber would engage purely with that. They're not engaging with panorama, they're absolutely on the surface itself. And so this work was for an audience to walk up this very, very steep route to reach this amazing set of rock pinnacles and a deep corrie and these high cliffs. And you can just see, you've probably thought, what the fuck is that thing hanging? And that's actually hanging off the end of a helicopter. And this was one of the most fragile landscapes in Europe. And by fragile, it contained bryophytes and mosses, very, very rare mosses. But it's well accessed as a tourist landscape. So already there's a very, very difficult tension between access and reasonable access and the protection of that landscape as a natural environment that will just be degraded through the act of going into it. So the authorities, the natural heritage authorities, were really profoundly scared of letting us near this place. And we spent 2 years evolving a planning proposal that required 68 mitigations to enable an audience to safely walk into this environment without damaging it. So we did a 20,000-point survey of the landscape, where we mapped every single area where there was a rare species down to 1 square metre. And then on the basis of that, helicoptered lighting decks into 14 prescribed positions marked with an orange peg. And then those lighting decks had battery systems on them that only required, they were from shipping industry, so they only required a narrow cable, which was just domestic size, which could be laid over the landscape with no permanent damage into the landscape. And then a series of aerial wireless signals where we could boost signals to switch the lights on and off. Theatrical lights switch on and off, and they use dimmers. But you can't use dimmers in this setting because they require three-phase, and we only had batteries. So we had to use car headlights. And we used car headlights because they could be dimmed up and down. We got a lighting manufacturer to invent a dimming system that would work with this. This was the work of an amazing guy called David Bryant, who I'll honour here in front of you. He died. This was the last work he ever did with us. He was an absolute genius with light. He was the sort of person who said, right, we want to go and do work on Skye up this mountain. We want to go there and we want to light it, but we can't take heavy equipment in. How can we do it? And he would spend that year working to actually develop technology from scratch to make it possible. But you can see it's still a little bit clunky. You're still helicoptering a deck into position. It's a little bit insane as a way of solving a problem. It's a little bit kind of counterintuitive, but it did work. And then we did things like if you were accessing the deck, you walked from a different position every day, so you never walked the same route, so your ground impact was minimized by walking 15 degrees. So even if you walked there 20 times, you never walked from the same position. And we had little books where we coded it. I mean, it was truly insane, the level we went to. But it was about the ultimate best practice, to prove that you could reasonably access a protected landscape and that humans have a right to interact with natural landscapes if they can do it reasonably and do it without damaging it. And then we raised 70 grand to rebuild the path. So we rebuilt the path so that people, because when it rains a lot, they step wider and wider and you get more and more impact. So we rebuilt the path so that people could go up and down, so the tourism impact would be less having done the work. There's one lovely story that with all the decks, once they were in place and after we'd been there for 6 weeks, all of the authorities came up to look and see what we'd done and to see the level of impact. And there was quite a lot of fear because it had never been done before to access a landscape this protected. And very silently and solemnly the whole team went up and we went to look at the decks and look at the ground impact. And there, growing under the decks, were a whole series of protected species which hadn't been seen on the island for 30 years because the sheep and rabbits hadn't been able to get to them. So there was this wonderful inversion that the intrusive technology had actually, strangely, protected the landscape. So again, those complex readings are all somehow within it. In this case, at this point, lighting technology had developed to a point where people had little head torches that were really bright enough to be able to light their own routes. So we were using the audience to actually light their own way up and down. About 8,000 people did it, and we only had one twisted ankle over quite seriously steep ground. So it kind of worked very well as a principle. And a young team of designers called Slight built these retro-reflective markers, which were taken from motorway technology. So when you're driving in a motorway and you flash your lights and the sign flashes back, that 3M technology is little reflective balls in the signs, and we took them and made strips, and so we made these little strips like Hansel and Gretel strips up the side of the paths, and just the head torch then reflected it back, and you had a very safe system, but the only impact was just a little spike from the peg. So again, it was beginning to work again. If you compare that to the path and the chunky generators, no fossil fuels burnt on the site, very low maintenance cable, and then just the one big intrusion being the helicopters dropping the wider elements in. And so you can see here the audience coming down in a time lapse and then sitting, and the 14 decks that we placed in the landscape were then able to create this very, very simple, very, very slow moving lighting that was just picking out different elements of the pinnacles and pretty much mimicking moonlight. I think in this landscape we decided to really work with the generosity of nature, because it's a very active landscape. This far north, it was getting the northern lights at certain times. You can actually see the lights reflecting off the cloud. So the cloud base would sometimes drop down, and you would have mist interacting, and it would suddenly in the same way as Japanese watercolours of landscape or Chinese watercolours would just dissolve a landscape, the mist would come down and just dissolve the landscape in front of your eyes. It would just disappear. And then it would lift, and then the pinnacles would reappear. It was just, I mean, on certain nights, it's just the most beautiful way to experience some natural phenomena in the world. So technology beginning to kind of, again, work with what's there a bit more now. It felt like we were beginning to really touch something a little bit more profound in terms of the way that we were doing it. And so I have two narratives going on. You have the why. You have the why you make the work, and you have the how you make the work. And the why and the how are beginning to fit together a bit more, beginning to join together a bit more in terms of what happened. But if I'm honest, the 2 years of the planning to get there, it kind of killed the enjoyment. I developed a serious whiskey problem. I had a bottle of whiskey in my glove compartment of my car, and I used to sort of swig it on my way home to the cottage, just feeling destroyed by the extent to which we had to prove ourselves, the lack of trust, the deep, deep, deep lack of trust. And sometimes the lack of trust in the artist is from the establishment, rather than seeing us as like, you know, we're the fucking standard bearers for democracy, for freedom of expression, for where the world can go, for better values. And often we end up having to apologize for what we are. I feel very, very strongly about the need for creative voices to really stand up and be very, very strong about who and what we are and the constituency that we represent. Because art at its best it's just integral to human progress. And it's integral to stopping some of the worst atrocities happen, which still happen en masse all around the world. But it's one of the things that can help us grow as a species. And Christ, we're still having to make excuses to people to allow us to do things. So, I've referenced this work because I won't talk about it in depth, but it does reference a Neolithic landscape that's probably the most relevant to some of the approaches within the older Australia. And in this part of Scotland, there's a lot of cup and ring marked stones, and a lot of linear burial settlements, probably from about 3,000 to 4,000 BC. And I went to with NVA to make a work here, and to attempt to begin to understand what those people were thinking when they marked those stones. And I had a really interesting insight just through my first picking up of some Aboriginal traditions on the use of particular symbolism. And what it showed was that the commonality of the spirals, and the use of the concentric circles moving outwards, carved into rock, and then lines and grooves running between them, and then using the natural cracks in the rock as well to connect them, that as far as I can read, the same symbols can mean many, many different things depending on what landscape that particular painting or particular object is describing. Whereas a kind of archaeological Western rational approach might look at this particular set of rocks and say it means one thing. That symbolism must have meant this to those people, rather than the idea that it might have been carved at different times and have meant many different things in different places. And I like that idea of the openness, that the symbolism, rather than referring to one thing, could refer to a multiplicity of realities. And nobody knows. I mean, there is absolutely no definitive understanding of of what the Neolithic carvings have done. But we created a number of sites, and in daytime, and it's the first time I've kind of worked against working at night, but tried to do something in daylight. And you can see there that there's a gap in the trees, and we created that gap, so we cut the forest down in order to recreate the understanding of the rock plinth sitting just halfway up a hill and halfway below water. Because in the death mythologies of Northern Europe, and particularly Scandinavian and Nordic traditions, the migration of the dead, the migration of the soul, is across water. So one of the definitions of understanding this topography is to understand its placement to water. So it was just one set of meanings. So we tried to actually open up some of these meanings into the landscape. This was a double wooden henge that we made in a forest. We created a performance there with National Theatre of Scotland, and created, the original Stonehenges were all made of wood, and so this is an exact replication of a double henge. And again, just playing with some of those forms and reusing them in a contemporary setting. And then in a number of daytime routes, this refers to, again, the inversion, the inverted tree, anyone who's followed that particular mythology. The millstone is really interesting, because the millstone is very, very concurrent in mythology from that period, where the lower part of a millstone, being static, would represent our static world. People thought this world was static. And then the upper moving part of the millstone would reference the stars moving around. And then the only star that didn't move was Polaris, the North Star. So the idea that the world was pinioning around one pole, and that pole being the symbolic pole that went down through the middle of the two millstones. So there's just a very, very interesting symbolism there of an early reading of the world, and of course the reading of above, middle and below, with the human realm being on the middle and the inversions above and below. So again, we were just playing and referencing that. And here working with an approach to a rock face, which had a series of saucer marks on it, which were probably made geologically, but could have been very early rock marks, but you couldn't tell. And again, no signage, there was absolutely nothing. You had to find it as a grid reference and walk quite a long way to get to this work. It's still there now. Very swampy, very, very degraded forest landscape. And the trees that you see at the side have intentionally, we worked with one of these huge these huge industrial forest vehicles. I mean, they're about the size of this room. And those trees were taken, plucked out, smashed in half and replaced into the actual landscape. So again, it was this idea of a sort of violated form. I try not to do nature as too loving, because it's not. It's pretty brutal. Most of nature is pretty brutal, really. Beautiful as it is. I think it feels important not to romanticize what's there. I'm really aware that I'm giving you this torrent of work, and I hope it's not too much. I could have chosen to speak just about one show. How are we doing time-wise? Quite tight. So it's hard. It's a difficult process to try and do justice, and I realise I can lose a few people along the way. It's hard to concentrate at the end of a long day. But what I've tried to do at least is show you a broad sweep of stuff, and then some of you who are interested can then pick up on that. But I do apologise for the kind of torrent of stuff that it leads on, and all the different ideas that it pulls in. I'll come back to the Invisible College last, because I think that's a reference there. So I'm now going to ask you to close your eyes for 10 seconds. I will count. Close your eyes now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Open. I'm now taking you through to final landscape work to show the full transition of working with movement in landscape. I think if you're going to make work about the things you're really passionate about. Make things about the things you really believe in or the things you want to do. So this work was the kind of ultimate for me because I made a work about running. I'm a really obsessive runner. I really love running. Endurance running, marathon, hill running, 10Ks, just running. I run to work. I run as a means of transport. I run to stay fit, but that's purely vanity. I run as a way of seeing the world. I run in every city I ever visit, I run to. It's just a beautiful way of moving. And so for the Olympics, I had the chance to actually make a work about running and about the act of running. So this is a really beautiful urban mountain, Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh. Some of you may have seen it if you've been over there. It's a really exceptional little geological feature in the centre of Edinburgh. Very protected. Again, no work like this has ever taken place there before, so we had to find ways to access that landscape and give access for an audience and people without doing any damage to it. And you can see here there's a great tilted basin that runs down below the main summit. And the work consisted of bringing together 4,000 hill runners, or people who were willing to train to be fit enough to run in an up and down setting. And we spent a couple of years developing a light technology where you could carry your own power and run in a light suit. And the light suit would articulate the human body. And each light suit would be individually controlled by wireless, so we could change the colour of any person in a suit, switch them on and off, flash them at incredible speed, 300 choices of colour. This is how things have changed. This is from the 14,000 light bulbs and 42 kilometres of cable. Now it's 300 colours and a light suit that you can run in. It's just in 10 years. Just amazing the way technology has grown. And this was us just doing trials. And our audience had light sticks, and they walked up to the summit of the mountain and looked down as we created patterns of light in the landscape made by the runners. So they were being choreographed. It was I can't tell you how complex it was. 120 runners in groups of 10, all running in sequence, 10 meters apart, learning the choreography from scratch on the night, following a run leader who'd spent a year learning the choreography, running at different gradations of speed, meters per second, so that the patterns would appear as if they were perfectly moving together across the landscape, whereas in fact some people would be running down very steep hills and some across flatter bits, but it had to look for the audience as if they were coming together at the same time. It was a real bugger to make. We had a Hollywood choreographer called Liza Bixler, and it really drove her mental. It was fantastic. It was a great, great challenge, and it made a really beautiful piece of work. And we took it from this. The beautiful thing is that the documentation of the work became as much as the work itself. So time-lapse, obviously the beauty of what you can do with time-lapse with cameras, meant that all the trails of light could be read as manifestations of movement through time and through landscape. And it was the first time that I really felt that the visual, as an artist, that the visual documentation of the work was becoming as powerful as the work itself. So this has become a bit of a worldwide phenomenon. We've taken it on tour over the last year, and we went from we went from that to that 7 weeks after we'd made the previous work. We went to Yokohama, the main docks, South Tokyo, to see if it would work, to see if we could translate the technology into this setting. And it did work as a principle. All the blue there is our runners. So the runners there are spread over 3 kilometers, 20 meters apart. It's a very interesting way to animate an urban landscape. So zero impact, literally zero impact. It's just people, bodies moving, the body moving through space. And it kind of gives you hope that the technologies, that you can still work in a very technical environment, but actually do it in a way that can merge with the work itself. This is the Daniel Libeskind building in Salford in North Manchester. It's actually a building I hate. I can't stand clad buildings. I think it looks cheap. But it reflected the lights really well. So I have to thank him for giving us that wonderful environment. This was the forecourt of a shopping mall. So it was really interesting. If you look at some of the early work, you'll see that I've chosen really numinous landscapes, sort of landscapes that have tremendous natural power. And this is the exact reverse. It's like going into a desecrated... I can't think of anything worse than the forecourt of a shopping mall. It's kind of death on a stick for me. Everything I hate. That sort of really bland face of corporate capitalism. You're just a walking wallet, ready to be, your money ripped out. And to take that and do something beautiful with it at night, so you can just sort of leave that world behind. And it worked, and it worked because it's an environment that needs some love, in the same way as industrial landscapes need some love. These kind of horrible, brutal, they're our reality. I mean, the Mall it's ubiquitous across the world. That's regeneration. And of course, they're often soulless. I mean, as we saw in this afternoon's talk, they're places that are defined by the lack of soul. So to bring a little bit of soul for those people who do live there, this was the sort of intention of this work. Yeah. So it's bringing a different set of values, and a very human set of values, because there's something beautiful about the simplicity of running, just the sort of humble act of running and just allowing it to speak of human energy and potential. So Alan kind of asked me to finish. That kind of caps the lighting work. Alan just asked me to finish by talking a little bit about St. Peter's. I'm now going to ask you to close your eyes again, because I need to, I think, to wind back. I'm going to wind back. I'm going to count to 10 again. Close your eyes. Now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay.
10 slides, Matthew.
10 slides. Okay. What time is it?
8.
It's 8. Oh my God, I'm really, really sorry. I said to Alan to give me a nod at 50 minutes. No wonder everyone's leaving. My God, you've got every right to leave. I was meant to talk for 50 minutes, and then we'd have a nice big answer question session, and I've destroyed you by going on far too long. So I really, really apologise. I should have edited myself far better, or spoken about less things. I really do apologise for that, because I did want to, and I'm still very happy to have questions for those who do want to stay. The Hidden Gardens was that capital work that we did in 2003, and then we decided about 6 years ago to do another capital work, and really to dedicate the rest of, for me, pretty much the rest of my working life. I've got about 20 years, I reckon, before I fall over. So I just wanted to do kind of one thing in one place that might encapsulate some of the themes and some of the issues that the work's talked about over the last 20 years. So we took on this slightly impossible challenge of attempting to find a viable use for what's known as the one of the greatest modernist ruins, certainly in the UK, if not wider. It's a work that is referenced internationally a lot. And that's St. Peter's Seminary, which you can see here is the kind of U shape that widens around this old baronial house in the west of Scotland. This will be a slight repeat journey for those who were here this morning, so I'll probably cut more to the use rather than talking too much about it. But we've been on a 4-year journey to find a use for this. It was actually Alan who coined the term, was to treat it as a productive landscape, and to bring this back as a productive landscape, and to recognise this as a unique piece of heritage. They trained priests here from 1966 to 1979, 13 years, and then it closed. It was a brief period as a drug rehabilitation centre in the early 80s, but it's been a ruin ever since. And while it's an incredible building, as with a lot of architecture of that period, it had many problems. The individual seminarians, the young trainee priest cells, each had a light bulb in their little cell. And it turned out the light bulbs could only be found in Denmark. So as a result, when a young priest went down to dinner, they often had to take their light bulb with them. Because if someone had a bust light bulb, the only way they could get light was to nick their next door neighbours. Very un-Christian. So there's all these wonderful stories. But it's a landscape that is absolutely replete with amazing history and heritage. One of the first stories we heard was that the Catholic Church, when they decanted to smaller churches in the new towns that were being built around Scotland at the time, there was a lot of new building, and the Catholic population sort of left the main urban centres and went to these smaller places. The churches were left with their statuary. So you had the Virgin Marys and you had the crucifixes, and of course the smaller churches just didn't have room for these sort of big plaster statues, but they're consecrated. So the story is that they buried quite a few of them in the grounds here. So the ground, you can just imagine these plaster forms rotting in the ground, and when we excavate, we might just find the odd. It's just fantastic. You couldn't write it, it's such a story. But the site's remarkable because Kilmahue, which is the older name for it, for those who know they're Irish or Gaelic, it would be the name for a small monk's cell, Cille. So Kilmahue would be the cell, the monk's cell for Mayhew. Saint Mayhew was an early Celtic Christian saint from Ireland. So when first Christianity migrated across to the UK in the 5th, 6th century, a first group of monks went and set up a small settlement just within the same area that 1,500 years later the Catholic Church built this seminary on. So it's an amazing spread of time that's encapsulated within this landscape. So you can almost hear from the way I'm talking about it, I think you have to set the building and these hugely problematic buildings within a wider history, and that history is in the landscape, and it's there in all the layers that exist as you go down into the ground. Everything's there, just beneath your feet. So with a bit of excavation, whether it's historic or actual physical excavation, you can begin to reveal amazing layers of past history and hopefully bring them alive again. And that's what we're really attempting to do. So NVA, working with a bunch of partners, has been in a 4-year process of attempting to bring value back to this landscape. And I got kind of obsessed with the idea of education. Rather than doing an art centre or something that works on environmental art, or there are a number of other strands that might exist in my previous work of doing art in the landscape. That I don't know if it's the same thing here, but when I went to college after school, it was free. I went to university in London and I got a grant, and not only that, I got my train fare paid to come down from Scotland, and I got housing benefit. And I got to sign on in the holidays because I couldn't get a job. I mean, my God, the freedom. Is that time? Is that like some little part of human history where democracy functioned in such a way that it felt that education was everything, and it was just good to allow anyone from any background to have free education? And I've got twin girls now, 11 years old, and I think in 6 years' time, what are they going to face? $40,000 worth of debt? That's your introduction to adult life. So your introduction isn't to knowledge, isn't to human growth, it's to a fucking great big debt that you're going to pay back. And you're going to pay it back by getting a good job as soon as you can. It's a sort of pressure that just wasn't there for us. For me, it was, I think the result of making this type of work is part of coming out of that sense of that life was all for finding out, knowledge and doing things, and there was no sense of getting a job. Deeply uncapitalist approach to life. But in the end, you give back. I mean, that's the whole point, is if you give education, if you give people the freedom to learn, they give back. Of course they'll put back into society. They might just not do it for a few years. I mean, I was in a fucking radical punk band. You know, and I had nothing to do. Now I've paid masses of tax in the last 10 years, and I'm quite happy to do that. I understand its value. But there's a real value in letting people be free for a while and growing and finding out who they are. And in the end, maybe doing meaningful jobs that are meaningful to them, not just a McJob, you know, a sort of crap job to because you're under pressure. So I felt this drive that education would be maybe a really important thing, and this is the history of this building. And simultaneously was my, through knowing Alan and knowing various other people in academia, was this real sense that too often knowledge stayed within the sources of the teaching base. Great thinking takes place within specialisms that goes out to a few students, and so much that could be unpacked to the wider world and shared with the wider world. So we kind of went down this free university idea, you know, like Joseph Beuys has done before and various people have done before. And it still has to be paid for, so we have done it through university research, through arts and humanities research. But what we did was get a bunch of really interesting academics from a bunch of different disciplines to come out and treat this as their playground. So this would be the subject. This amazing site would be the place where in its ruined state we would begin to explore themes and begin to find ways to generate knowledge and generate new thinking. And that's what we've done over the last couple of years, is to just spend time working in its current state. And this means with nothing. This means in an absolutely brutalized environment without any physical intervention at all. This is what we hope to do in the long run, is just bring one part of it back into productive use as a restored, partially restored chapel, which can house many different things. You can imagine, if I asked each of you a use for that space, you would come up with a different use. It might have a sacral function, it might have an exhibition function, it'd be an amazing place for an all-nighter, amazing place to do music, to allow people to respond to it. So I'm speaking to our national companies in Scotland about them creating work specifically with that space in mind. Let the space dictate the type of work that takes place within it. So very much in that site-responsive tradition. But allow it to be open and clean and be used in a number of different ways. But keep it within that brutalized outer form. So we just stop that falling down. And then create this heart in the middle of it. And we'll know in a year if it's going to happen. It's about 10 million for the initial scheme. And it has all the governmental support. So we're getting they're responding to it. But it breaks ground because it's a different regeneration model to the standard one. And so it's difficult. It's a difficult one to win people over to. But that's it. And I really do apologise for speaking so long. I really didn't mean to. I hoped it would be shorter. But I hope that some of it has touched you in some ways. And thanks for your patience in staying with me.